Recently, Daystar made the decision to terminate my son Jonathan Lamb's employment.
Though there had been rumors of Joni Lamb and Daystar for years, nobody anticipated this. Recently, Julie Roy uncovered an incredible discovery that is upending the Christian media landscape. There's no guess here. This damages Daystar's reputation, which they have spent decades trying to maintain. Increases in wealth, influence, and power. The truth might destroy everything now that what was concealed is public knowledge. If you believed you knew Joni Lamb, you were mistaken. Everything has altered because of this. Stardom wasn't always accompanied with controversy. For a long time, it was actually a fantastic illustration of what contemporary Christian TV and radio could be. The network was established by Marcus and Joni Lamb. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing content. And hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Now, back to the topic. What we were talking about was well known for discussing hope, healing, faith, and salvation. The sermons weren't the only reason people watched. They looked to Daystar for solace when they were ill, support when they were struggling, and a feeling of community when they were isolated. It was more than simply a television program to those who watched it. In spirit, it was like a brother. Joni Lamb in particular became a symbol of that solace. Because she was composed and had a charming smile, millions of people trusted her. That trust deepened after Marcus's death. In addition to being a co-founder, she was regarded as a widow who honorably and resolutely carried on her late husband's work. Because it frequently featured tales of recovery, forgiveness, and triumphing over adversity, her program, Joni Table Talk, became a fixture in many homes. Long ago, there was no cause to doubt the network's core values or leader. However, once respect is established, it is not always maintained. With time, fissures appeared. It was tiny at start, but it developed rapidly. The rumors were circulating. The number of donors was steadily increasing. However, it appeared that the requirements of the community were not considered. While the audience continued to watch, former cast members began to speak behind the scenes. People began to learn about Daystar's inefficient spending, cunning choices, and widening discrepancy between its objectives and its actions. Then the probe started. As a reporter, Julie Royce did more than simply document her observations. She had entered the Daystar universe. She was acquainted with a few lambs. She had personally witnessed the operation of the machine. She also didn't return empty-handed as a reporter. Testimonies, documents, and interviews from those who had been silenced for too long were brought in by her. Daystar's reputation as a committed, capable, and reliable individual started to deteriorate. There was more to the stories than money. They had to contend with commands and lies. After our journey, we returned home. Yes, that was in July. In addition, many people are wondering why Daystar spent $100,000 on Yes. That's what I was going to ask you. Therefore, the answer is no, we paid for our trip entirely out of Daystar funds. We covered the cost of our honeymoon. All right. Because of it, again, that is untrue. The private airplane was the one that startled me the most. Every donation is like sowing a seed in God's work, according to Daystar. However, when Roy discovered that donor funds had been spent on leisure rather than employment, everything changed. Those who had already spent their entire budget felt defrauded. In an instant, the trust they had established over the years was shattered. People mistakenly believed they were witnessing a church, but in reality, they were witnessing a clandestine enterprise that had no accountability. Joni's reputation started to deteriorate as additional stories surfaced. Her statements were nonsensical. Her responses appeared prepared. She discussed God's purpose and forgiveness, but she avoided discussing Julie's financial or political issues. Opened. They began to separate from one another. Those that were devoted to it left. It felt more like putting out fires than a divine assignment. What was happening was visible to us. The Daystar picture remained intact. It occurred as a result of the ministry's years-long decisions that further distanced it from its foundation. Furthermore, when the curtain finally came down, the fall was not the fault of the reviewers or the media. Pride was the reason they remained motionless and refused to be open. The truth could no longer be concealed. Openness had replaced reverence. That is, behind the Bible's words, not in the background or behind the polished facade of Christian television. It began as any other show would. The music was lively and the set was comfortable. The TV host talked rapidly and passionately. Another option to raise money is through a Daystar telethon. No matter how tiny their faith is today, it will grow, the assembly was reminded. In exchange for $1,000 zero, you ought to receive $10,000 zero. From God Himself, not from the network. The message had been heard countless times before. But what followed would permanently alter Daystar's image. Initially, a former employee who had overseen one of these fundraising events meticulously recounted the story. She wasn't a high-ranking manager or a strong individual. She only answered calls for gifts as a receptionist. The phones continued to ring that day. Even those who didn't typically answer the phone had to pitch in. At that point, she picked up the phone that would not go away. Every 6 months, they have their telethon there. Hundreds of employees spend the entire day answering phones in a room filled with booths and phones, which I believe is now known as Heart for the World. The department was also responsible for answering calls from contributors during the telethon. However, there were occasions when the volume of calls was so high that all employees had to put their phones on wait. Thus, this was one of those unique occasions. Many folks were phoning. My phone immediately rang. This nice little old lady tells me how much debt she has while crying. As someone on the show stated that if you give $1,000 today, God will repay $10,000, she intends to give Daystar the little money she has left on her credit card even though she doesn't have any cash on hand. Words cannot express how terrible I felt when I ran the card and saw that number. It seemed so incorrect. She didn't want to be a part of it, she was alone, and she owed a lot of money. When I heard an elderly woman crying, I paused and asked myself, do I want to be a part of this? Is this the kingdom of God? Because I don't know how you can justify that before. But there was still hope for her. On live, the host had just informed her that a $1,000 donation would result in nothing. God would give them 10 times as much blessings. She didn't have any cash on hand, but she did have some money remaining on her credit card. She was going to give it to Daystar because that was all she had left. The hands of the employees were trembling. She was at a loss for words. She was aware that the amount of money this woman was giving was excessive. She felt awful about it, but she had no choice. The payment ended at this point. That phone call changed her completely. It appeared that what had been a mission had become more like a machine, and that the promise of trust was more like deception. Julie Roy, an independent journalist, took that tale as a message. That was not the only woman. Thousands or perhaps hundreds of people followed suit. People whose contributions were described as a means of receiving God's blessing and as more than just a gift. Moreover, they contributed without being aware that their funds will be utilized to purchase private aircraft. Because when that woman gave away her last $1,000, Daystar officials were traveling in luxury. Julie Roy was already looking through documents, tracking expenditures, and speaking with sources. She learned that the network had used donor funds to purchase a private jet. It was easy to explain, a government trip. Julie, however, discovered that there was more going on. The jet was utilized for more than just that. Private travel was occasionally done with it. Opulent, silent, and concealed. As she dug, it grew worse. That jet had evolved into a societal icon that represented power, comfort, and riches. They were all funded by donors who thought their contributions would support the gospel, the impoverished, and overseas missions. It wasn't simply poor manners that Julie displayed. She recognized a trend, a means of using donors' confidence to create something unrelated to ministry. The financial trail brought first-class accommodations, expensive meals, and upscale hotels. Meanwhile, one telethon after another messed with people's emotions. They were promised that their money would improve people's lives, fix them, and help them enter God's kingdom. For those at the top, it frequently meant a much better living, but it also meant less hassle. The question has been circulating ever since. Despite calling itself a church, Daystar functions more like a company. What distinguished it from other groups exempt from filing taxes to the public? Why was it so secretive about its finances? Julie Roy discovered that Daystar was able to circumvent several of the openness regulations that most ministries must adhere to because of its classification. As a result, it might continue to spend funds without being held accountable to the public and may continue to hide its sources. I could relate to the old woman and the jet story. It took a while for the news story to disappear. It remained there. Because it gave the grief a voice and a face, people were able to remember it. That woman could have been a mother or a grandmother to anyone. And she wasn't giving away for nothing. She was desperate and was giving up faith in what she believed to be a divine promise. The situation rapidly deteriorated. Fans of Daystar started to distance themselves. Churches that had previously aired Daystar shows started to wonder about their relationship. Social media was ablaze with reactions. Heartbreak, rage, and sadness. The money no longer even mattered to some people. It was about trust failing you. It became evident that there was a growing discrepancy between what was said and what was actually done. A longtime network spokesperson, Joni Lamb, attempted to address the mounting grievances. She refuted claims that gift money had been pilfered and utilized for private benefit. According to her, the plane was crucial to their global operations. However, the harm had already been done. Because Daystar's board remained silent, the responses were evasive, and there was no genuine transparency, the situation deteriorated. Julie Royce repeatedly examined it. She discovered a greater number of dubious financial choices, more staff complaints of stress and anxiety, and more similar exchanges with contributors. Those who genuinely donate but feel taken advantage of. Previously perceived as spiritual and mission-driven, Daystar's culture was now perceived as private and domineering. The tale of the jet and the elderly donor ultimately created quite a stir. It evolved into a significant moment. Even the most devoted supporters were forced to stand back and reconsider their support at that time. It raised issues that Daystar was unable to resolve without disclosing more of what they had been trying so hard to hide. Faith-based media as a whole, not simply one network, became the focus of a broader discussion. At what point does a mission transition from a ministry to a business? When leaders live comfortably and their people struggle, what is going on? Is God's will still in place? It's unlikely that the woman on the phone will ever realize how much she contributed to the disclosure of the truth. But when she poured everything she had at it in the hopes of a miracle, she revealed a system that had gone awry and unknowingly. Daystar's situation changed at that point. It didn't happen all at once, other from that. Like a structure gradually losing its foundation before the walls collapse, Daystar's reputation began to crumble piece by piece. As more individuals investigated, it became clear that it was far more than a private jet, a dubious gift, or even one violated promise. Power and the manipulation of spiritual authority for political ends rather than human ones were discussed. Trust has been the foundation of Daystar's operations for many years. It was more than just a Christian television network. For many onlookers, it served as a spiritual haven. Every day, people searched it for guidance, inspiration, and hope. Everyone was treated like family by the hosts, and Joni Lamb was the one that everyone could rely on because of her composed demeanor and sincere eyes. In actuality, there were changes taking place in the background. Julie Royce, an investigative reporter, discovered items that damaged Daystar's reputation when she began to pose difficult questions. Bad money handling was not the only thing happening. People were becoming more and more interested in politics, which seemed more like manipulation than service. Funds intended to support mission trips and prayer lines were being surreptitiously diverted to causes that prioritized power above faith. The content of Daystar was altered during election years. People were suddenly witnessing political endorsements, speeches at rallies, and visitors who were more concerned with national policy than spiritual development in place of sermons and praise music. What began as silent support gradually became more vocal. A few broadcasters even attended political events and combined campaign slogans with religious terms and expressions. This made it difficult to distinguish between politics and religion, which is harmful. Although Daystar never publicly stated, "We support this candidate," the message was evident from the well-curated guest lists, heartfelt appeals, and subtly worded phrasing. In terms of politics, the network was very active. Many folks who had previously seen it were similarly taken aback. The news regarding the upcoming election didn't have their attention. They tuned in to find serenity, heal, and pray. They were now being subtly instructed on who they ought to support. Even worse was the fact that Daystar continued to function as a church in its formal capacity. As a result, it offered significant advantages. They have other legal advantages that ordinary reporters can't even fathom, such as not having to pay taxes or having their financial details made public. However, that came with responsibilities as well. IRS regulations are extremely stringent. While a church may discuss social issues, it is inappropriate for them to openly support political parties or candidates. Daystar nevertheless crossed it numerous times. The network appeared to flagrantly violate these guidelines in several of the scenarios Julie Roy documented. Instead of testifying or discussing their beliefs, politicians were asked to promote their views. A few of the performances began to resemble political advertisements more than ministry shows. According to insiders, preaching the gospel was not the purpose of the behind-the-camera preparatory discussions. Getting along with the authorities was the aim. Everything has a price. Trust started to decline as more people became aware of it. Some experienced it gradually, and they were constantly aware that something wasn't quite right. A few were struck quickly and forcefully. They saw their revered spiritual leaders' abrupt political remarks. They believed they were being taken advantage of, misled, and manipulated. It was best put by someone who used to work there. The mention of Jesus had ceased. Being in charge became the issue. After years of regular contributions, donors began to question whether their tithes had paid for political advertisements. Churches that have previously collaborated with Daystar started to distance themselves. Some even claimed that during events, the network's programming could not be played. The reputation that Joni Lamb had worked so hard to establish was beginning to crumble. It was due to a system that relied on faith to gain power, not a single error. Furthermore, it was still unclear what was happening. Joni made ambiguous statements and largely dismissed concerns as media fabrications or hostile threats. The facts were accurate, though. Information regarding money was associated with changes in politics. Internal discussions about elections were corroborated by former employees. The receipts were visible to anyone who observed. They continued to take screenshots, make movies, and appear in public. The grievances weren't limited to external sources. The Christian community was deeply divided. For some, Daystar was merely an indication of reality. It was seen by some as an assault on the core beliefs of the church. Churches, neighborhood associations, and even families got involved in fights. Was Daystar being honest or courageous? Daystar actually had every right to express their opinions. However, many believed it was unethical to exploit its position to try to influence voters with spiritual power by combining prayer requests with political rhetoric. The ministry had changed. It was a commercial. It appeared to be a power strategy. Despite the continual criticism, Joni Lamb continued to perform and promote hope in the midst of all of this. The fact that she refused to confront the political issues head-on simply fueled the fire. When asked to be candid and open, she chose to remain silent. She shifted the topic while they pleaded with her to take responsibility. Every time Julie Royce's report was released, it got worse. She spoke with former contributors who believed they had been misled, staff personnel who felt stifled, and pastors who had previously donated money. Daystar was once a shining example of a Christian leader, but today people feel guilty when they bring up the name. The network took a long time to shut down. The performances continued. The lights were still on. However, there was an issue. The government's credibility, which is essential to its operation, was lost. Daystar wasn't the only topic of conversation. The argument sparked a much larger discussion in the religious community about the perils of unbridled power, the relationship between God and politics, and what happens when you cede your freedom to authority. Because trust was at the heart of this. Daystar has the time, money, and emotions of individuals. They supported its objective. They had faith in Joni. And as it became clear that everything was a part of a larger scheme, the deception hit home. In a mental and spiritual sense. Today, Daystar's tale serves as a cautionary tale, demonstrating that no individual, group, or leader is exempt from accountability. That faith is neither a political instrument nor a tradable good. It is valued. And if leaders lose sight of it, everything will collapse. The harm caused by Joni Lamb in the video cannot be undone now. He used to believe that decisions made within Daystar's walls, rather than external threats, were the reason its light had faded. Whispers and suspicions that individuals pushed to the back of their minds were the first indications. There was a private jet there and a strange political visitor here. With all of the heartfelt stories and praise music, it was easy to overlook things that didn't feel quite right. Daystar had been a spiritual sanctuary for years. Many individuals went there to feel like they belonged, to pray, and to obtain treatment. It had the serene, self-assured, and faith-filled visage of Joni Lamb. People could talk to her about anything, and they could rely on her voice in difficult situations. Now that it's all over, though, that voice sounds different. People's confidence has been betrayed. Many others also lost confidence in the ruins. This is not merely a tale of politics or money interfering. People's faith was strongly tied to a church they donated to, and it's about how terrible it is to take that faith for granted. Julie Roy, an investigative reporter, revealed what was happening behind the scenes, and it did more than just shock people. It hurt. Those who had donated for decades felt misled. After displaying Daystar's content in their sanctuary, church organizations suddenly began to question everything. Was it all a lie? Or witnessed a lovely thing gradually deteriorate without anyone noticing? Is anyone else experiencing the same emotions? With shock from SMT. The realization that there was not a single poor decision was the most difficult. Everything came together. A gradual decline in morals concealed by smiles and the Bible. Overspending. Political combinations. Where there should have been answers, there was silence. In these events, there was no chance. You could pick them. Many felt that their ideals had been exploited against them as a result of their decisions. Losing can cause certain kind of agony. Have faith in a close relative. Millions of people use Daystar for more than just watching television. They had to deal with it. They witnessed it in the waiting area of the hospital. When things were terrible, they could be heard talking in the living room. The assurance that they were not forgotten by God. Therefore, it didn't feel like a scandal when the Fishers appeared. It was intimate. Joni Lamb remained steadfast, but not in a humble manner, despite mounting evidence that she was innocent. Rather, she gave evasive assurances and prepared comments. She doubled down rather than apologize or open the books. Persecution, she said. She perceived it as an assault on religion. And if people weren't already in suffering, perhaps that might have been effective. But they were. Furthermore, pretending everything was well exacerbated the wound.